biology and geology, and has taught at a number of universities courses on this. And also for 20 years, I think he's been leading a similar group over in Portland called DSA, Design Science Associates. And that's also on the website. You know, most organizations have a website, and you can look at past talks that have been done there by different speakers. And so Keith has been doing that for a long time, as well as teaching. And they meet on Saturday morning of all times, and they get a great turnout on that. So with that, Keith, come on up and explain your talk.
Well, thank you, Heinz. First of all, I want to introduce my wife, Connie, down here in the second row. We're glad to be here. I mean, we are really glad to be here. We left Portland early so we wouldn't get late for this, and it took us about 7 hours from Portland. Normally it takes 4 hours. You do have a little traffic problem. It was incredible. But we made it, so we're happy about that. The title of today's program is Forests Declare the Glory of God. You've heard the Bible says the heavens declare the glory of God. Very true. But I'm also saying forests do declare the glory of God, and I'll try to show you that. There's no better place. There we go. There's no better place in which to contemplate that message than here in a redwood forest in Northern California in the early morning fog. How many have seen the redwoods? Oh, most of you. That's great. It's a great place to go and hike and camp. We've enjoyed it greatly. Coast redwoods at up to about 380 feet are the tallest trees on Earth. Giant sequoias, in contrast, rarely top 300 feet, but they're the most massive trees on Earth. And bristlecone pines are the oldest. Well, after the sun has burned off the mists of morning, these vine maples display their vibrant green color in the understory of the redwood forest. And here we see a real profusion of sword ferns covering the forest floor. And a banana slug patrols the greenery. I think that's quite a beautiful creature, actually. And I'll show you why I think that coming up. Sometimes large animals like a Roosevelt elk are seen. Now, in the spring of 1992, Portland's Design Science Association, which Heinz mentioned, began offering forest field trips, not in the redwoods, but along the Clackamas River in the Mount Hood National Forest. And since that time, about 30 years ago, we've conducted close to 100 forest trips with over 1,000 participants. So we're happy to see people get out in the woods, see it firsthand. It's good to read about it and look at pictures, but getting out there is the real thing. But in September of 2020, the massive 138,000-acre Riverside fire burned our Clackamas site, as seen here. And we then moved our trips to the beautiful forest along the Salmon River, also in the Mount Hood National Forest, and we continue to have trips there to this day. Now, before I go further, I need to define a couple of terms. For the last 21 years, I've taught courses in ecology at Multnomah University and then at Jessup University. And soon after I started 20 years ago, another professor told me that he was very surprised that a Christian school would teach such a subject. Apparently, he is equating ecology with something more like radical environmentalism. And I've had other responses like that as well. So here's a definition of ecology. First of all, ecology is a division of biology, biology being the scientific study of life. And it deals with the interactions between organisms and their environments. It's as simple as that. So examples of ecological topics would include studying the behavior of forest fires, like that big Riverside fire, or determining why Western Oregon forests are dominated by conifer trees, needle trees, but if you go to the Appalachian Mountains in the east, they all have broadleaf trees. Why is that? That's a question of ecology. or maybe documenting the biological responses to the eruption of Mount St. Helens. That's an ecological study. So also, some simply define ecology, as it says at the bottom there, the study of ecosystems. And that's my second term. What is an ecosystem? Well, an ecosystem, first of all, is a system. And a system is a group of parts working together as a whole, like the human body is a system. My automobile, most of the time at least, is a system. And Multnomah University was a system. They closed down the undergraduate program, that's why I say that. And then an ecosystem is a system, first of all, and it includes all the living things in a given area. And you call that the biota. And it also includes all the non-living things, the abiotic things like the fire, sunshine, mountains, everything, dirt, such. All of that working together as a system. That's what an ecosystem is. So does a forest like this consist just of the trees? No, it includes everything. It is an ecosystem. Now, as in all matters, we at Design Science Association want to base our thinking about forests, in this case, on a biblical worldview. So what does the Bible say about forests? It says quite a bit, so I'll be real brief on this. But here are some biblical teachings that relate to forests. First of all, God created the earth in Creation Week, and that would include forest ecosystems. Therefore, we expect, when we look at forests, to find evidences of design, irreducible complexity, beauty, and so forth. Not just in the organisms, but in the system itself. It is amazing how complex and organized the forest ecosystems are. Secondly, in God, because He is the creator, He owns the earth, including forests. The forests ultimately are His property. And being omniscient, God has exhaustive knowledge of His creation, including forests and what goes on in them. He controls the processes also that operate in forest ecosystems, like photosynthesis, the hydrologic cycle, and so forth. But God also delegated to mankind dominion to manage the creation for mankind's good and for God's glory. And that's important for us to remember. This includes timber harvest, such as in the book of Ezra, where it describes harvesting logs for the building of the temple. The dominion mandate in Scripture also seems to imply that people must acquire knowledge of the creation, that is, in our case, forests, in order to manage it well. And you acquire that knowledge through good scientific observation, scientific studies. In order to be good stewards, you must have knowledge. Lastly, I put down that the curse and Noah's flood and the subsequent ice age profoundly affected forests in many, many ways. Well, let's move on now and look at some of the ecology topics that relate to the Northwest forests. This image is of one of our big conifer trees. And by conifer, I mean just cone-bearing trees. And this is a Sitka spruce, which requires lots of rain and fog, and so it only grows near the Pacific Ocean. And I took this photo in the Olympic National Forest. And shown here is a map of the Northwest forest, the dark area on this map. And it's often called the Pacific Maritime Forest, or oftentimes I will just call it the West Side Forest. It's a simple term. It begins in the south in the Redwoods of California, extends across western Oregon and Washington, British Columbia, up almost to Glacier Bay in Alaska. Some 2,000 miles or so of a once continuous forested strip of land. In Oregon and Washington, this wet coastal strip extends from the Pacific Ocean to the crest of the Cascade Range and a little beyond. And then further east, in the rain shadow of the Cascades, there are dry forests of pine and oak and juniper. And this diagram is important, and it shows two basic types of forests that we see in our area. Look at the bottom diagram first. At the left, the previous forest was clear-cut, the logs hauled to a mill, and the remaining forest debris piled up and probably burned. The site was then treated with herbicides and then replanted with one tree species. Usually it's Douglas fir around here. And then every 35 to 70 years or so, the process is repeated. And this is an effective way of producing wood products. But it's basically a farm. It's an agricultural means of growing wood. Usually these are called forest plantations. And in many of our areas, many of our forests, about 90% of the forests are in this form of a plantation. But look at the top one, and that's very different. At the left, there was a fire, destroyed some of the trees and did some damage, but then after the fire, it depicts a 300 or so year period of that forest regrowing and getting larger and more complex and just changing greatly. So that you can see that the top forest, which we would call a natural forest or an unmanaged forest, is very different than the plantation forest. Very, very different in many, many ways. Tonight I'm going to talk mostly about the unmanaged forest, because I think it's reasonable to think that evidences of the Creator's design and providential care would be more evident in that sort of forest than in the plantation, so we'll dwell on that. Listed here are 5 important trees that I'll talk a little bit about, and there, of course, are more that I don't have listed here, but I listed the Douglas fir, the western hemlock, and the western red cedar as conifer or cone-bearing trees, and then 2 broadleaf trees, the bigleaf maple and the red alder. And so let's look at those briefly. And here we see a branch of a Douglas fir. Notice that I hyphenated the name Douglas fir. The reason for that is a Douglas fir is not a fir. What is it? It's a Douglas fir. It's a separate species, a separate group of organisms. It's not like a noble fir or a grand fir. Those are real firs, or true firs, and you don't hyphenate the word. The needles of Douglas fir are relatively short, and they're attached singly, not in groups, but singly on all sides of the twig, and it gives that sort of a bottle brush, bushy appearance. And I am told on authority that an average 200-foot Douglas fir has about 60 million needles with a total surface area of over 1 acre. I do wonder what poor graduate student had to figure that one out. That's probably accurate. Douglas fir's buds are reddish in color and distinctly pointed. You can recognize them easily. And the seed cones are unique. And you probably have looked at these, but they have these 3-pointed bracts, so-called, protruding between the scales. And you might wonder, how did that come to be? Well, once upon a time, there was a big forest fire. And all the mice in the forest, and these are really, really tiny mice, they got scared. And so they knew that a Douglas fir tree tends to resist forest fires, often lives through forest fires. And so they climbed up this big Douglas fir tree, and they tried to hide in between the scales of the cones. But they couldn't quite make it in, so to this very, very day, you see the tail and the 2 hind legs hanging out between the scales. Now that, I think, comes to us from the native peoples on down through outdoor school, and now it's taught in universities. So it's a little easier to remember the story than to remember a 3-pointed bract. That's not very exciting. A Douglas fir seed, one seed is shown here. You can see it has a wing, which is for dispersal. The wind will carry it. But look at the dark part, and just realize that in that dark area, that seed, all the genetic information needed to produce a 250-foot giant of the forest is contained. And as you think about that, that's just utterly amazing. Douglas fir bark is very thick and furrowed, and if you cut into it, Well, I'll just say that the mice were right. And the reason that the Douglas fir resists fire, or lives through forest fires, is this thick bark. That's one reason, at least. Because the living part of a tree trunk is just a small area inside the bark, a couple layers of cells. And the rest of it is non-living. So this bark protects the living part of a tree trunk. And those areas are called the phloem and the cambium. Now, if you cut into the bark with your pocket knife, you notice this distinctive pattern of light and dark that sort of looks like a stack of bacon. That helps you recognize Douglas fir as well. Well, let's move on. And western hemlock looks very different than Doug fir. Needles are shorter and they vary in length, and the foliage is more flat than bushy. And its cones are quite small. And hemlock's bark is thin. So in contrast to Douglas fir, it is readily killed by forest fire. Western red cedar grows in wet areas, and it's really easy to recognize because its foliage, well, it's not made of needles at all. It's made of tiny little scales that are put together in this sort of lacy pattern. And the cones look like miniature rosebuds, it is said, and I think that's probably true. Big leaf maple is the main broadleaf tree that you're going to find out in our older forests. It grows in the Douglas fir hemlock forests, and it's about the only broadleaf hardwood that you find out there. And its leaves really are big. The other thing about it is that when you look at the branches, it's oftentimes just covered with mosses and ferns and lichens and other things. And especially if you go like to the Olympic Peninsula and in the whole rainforest, you'll see just great examples of this. And I'll come back to this topic in a bit. Our last tree is red alder, and it grows in very disturbed areas, such as in forest fire burns or sometimes along streams that flood and such. And it's seldom found in the old-growth forests at all, but it's of importance and of interest to us, so I'll mention it here. This was a very disturbed area because I took this along the Hummocks Trail at Mount St. Helens after the eruption, and you can see the alder recovering very, very quickly and very well. Now, consider this question. We could ask what parts of a forest are the most biologically active? That is, they have the most organisms and the most processes. And the answer is two places: the forest canopy up there and the forest floor and soil down there. And it turns out that these are also probably the most poorly understood parts of a forest, largely because they're hard to access and they're very complex. So we tend to look at the forest at eye level, and studies have been done, where scientists can see things readily. But that's a problem, and somebody has likened our limited knowledge of the canopy of the forest to a doctor who, in diagnosing his patients, only looks at the person's legs and avoids the rest of the person. That's what we're doing sometimes in the forest when we don't have a knowledge of the canopy. And we'll come back to the idea of a forest canopy in a bit. Forest canopy is simply defined as the upper layer of a forest composed of mature tree crowns and various organisms. So let's go visit the canopy. And here's just the place. The Wind River Canopy Crane Research Facility in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest near Carson, Washington. I took a short course in canopy science there in 1999. Now, you can't do that at this time because the crane was in place from 1995 to 2011, 16 years, and then it was dismantled. But here's how one gets up into the canopy, or got up in the canopy in that research crane facility, in a so-called gondola. And that gondola was then hoisted by this large construction crane 225 feet up in the air. And the crane had been brought from San Francisco, where it was used to build skyscrapers, and then implanted in a huge amount of concrete out in the forest to study the forest canopy. This is David Shaw. He's a forest ecologist, and he was director of the research of the canopy. For safety, we all wore hard hats and harnesses that were tethered to the gondola, and no one did fall out, so we were fine. So we're now up in the air looking down on a forest of 200-foot trees. And the crane operator was able to move this gondola from ground level up to 225 feet. Also, he could move it out on the jib, the long arm of the crane, and he could turn that jib around in a 360-degree circle. So there was a big cylinder that was in the reach of the canopy crane. The trees within reach of the crane all had numbers. And so a researcher could tell the operator of the crane that today he wanted to be placed next to tree number 48 at 150 feet. So the operator would push some buttons on his computer, and the gondola would glide to that precise location. Someone likened our silent, effortless glide through the trees to scuba diving on a coral reef. I guess there's some comparison. It was certainly a unique experience. This is the top of a tall, dead tree that we're seeing here, called a snag, and snags, of course, are important for wildlife. Hanging onto this tree is a species of lichen called old man's beard, and I don't qualify, but if you don't remember what a lichen is, let me just explain that briefly, because we're going to talk a little bit about lichens coming up. And a lichen is a symbiosis. That is, it's a close living association between a fungus, which makes the structure of the lichen, and cells of algae, which are green. They photosynthesize, and they feed themselves, and they feed the fungus. So it's a good mutual relationship. Sometimes there are special bacteria that we'll mention coming down the line here that also are found in lichens and are very important. Now, plants like these lichens that live in the forest are called epiphytes. An epiphyte is a plant or a lichen that grows on another plant, oftentimes on a tree, without harming it. They're not parasites. They don't harm it. And epi means upon, phyte means plant. So it's a plant growing on another plant, as we saw with those old man beard lichens. Examples of the lichens include things like mosses and ferns, and if you go to the tropics, the beautiful bromeliads and the orchids are epiphytes. Now, we're going to talk about canopy research just a bit, and canopy research began in the 1970s at Oregon State University. And it focused initially on the process of nitrogen fixation. How many are familiar with that term? 2, 3. Okay. So let me just go over that because it's important. All organisms, you and I and everything else, require nitrogen because nitrogen is used to make proteins. It's used to make enzymes. It's used in making DNA and RNA, all important stuff. So we need nitrogen. Of course, there's a lot of nitrogen around. The air is 78% nitrogen. But gaseous nitrogen can't be used by organisms, or most organisms at least. But there are special bacteria, certain types of bacteria, that can take nitrogen from the air and they put it into a chemical compound, think fertilizer, something like ammonia or nitrates. And that's called nitrogen fixation. And then there's some plants and there's some lichens which cannot fix nitrogen, but what they do is they make homes for those bacteria that do fix nitrogen. Like if you take a soybean plant and you pull it up, you look at the roots, there's little nodules all over the roots of the soybean plant. Well, the little nodules are homes for nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Those homes were made by the plant, but they're for the bacteria to live in and produce nitrogen, which is essential for a healthy forest. Now, this is the Salmon River, where we conduct field trips, and you can see a stand of red alder to the left, and it's right along the river. And the alder trees fix nitrogen very well. They just pump nitrogen into the soil, and it's of great benefit that they do that. But you look at the mountain there where it says conifers. There's no alder up there. And that forest also needs nitrogen, and it needs it for a great period of time, a great span of time. And how does that forest get its nitrogen? And back in the 1970s, there was no answer to that question. So at Oregon State University, one scientist named Bill Dennison decided to dig into that question and try to find an answer. And he became interested in the lichen shown here. Now that doesn't look like old man's beard, but lichens have all kinds of different sizes, shapes, colors, and they many of them look different from each other. But this is a lichen. It's called lungwort, and scientific name Loberia oregana, and it's extremely important. Dennison found it was scattered all over the forest floors, only in the old forest. But if he went to a young forest, there was none of this there. If you go to plantations, there's none of it there. And so he wondered if this could be a nitrogen fixer in the old-growth forests. And so he took some to his lab and did some chemical tests, and it fixed nitrogen fantastically well. The next question then was, is there enough of this growing in the canopy up there that it could support or provide the nitrogen necessary for the forest? Was there enough up there? And that posed a problem. Back in the 1970s, the forest canopy was pretty much totally unexplored. No one had been up there to speak of. It seemed like it was impossible to do research up there. It was hard to get to and dangerous and so forth. So Dennison was kind of stuck. And he explained his problem to his students at Oregon State University. And after class one day, two young ladies came up to him. Their names were Diane Tracy and Diane Nielsen, and said, Dr. Dennison, we think we can get you guys up in the canopy of the forest. Turned out they were both skilled rock climbers, and they felt they could adapt their rock climbing techniques to climbing 200-foot trees, which they did, and did well. And so that was really, when they got up there, they found that this loberia was all over the place. There was a 1/4 ton per acre in the forest they were studying, lots and lots of it. And that was the beginning of canopy research in the Northwest, but basically also in the world at that time. That was probably the first successful study done in the canopy. Well, here's just a little summary of nitrogen fixation after a forest fire. After a fire has burned through an area, there's a plant called ceanothus or snowbrush. Anybody heard of that? Ceanothus? Nope. It is kind of strange because ceanothus, what produces a lot of seeds, they all fall down to the floor or the soil, and nothing grows up. They stay in the soil for maybe decades, a long time. And the only thing that wakes them up so they germinate and produce plants is the heat of a forest fire. So a fire comes through, the ceanothus seeds come alive, and the shrubs grow and produce nitrogen, or at least they make homes for the nitrogen bacteria, and that works really well. On the moister sites, like we showed you along the river, the red alder does the same thing. It persists for maybe several decades in producing nitrogen for the forest. After about 100 years after a forest fire, neither of these plants are there. They've been outcompeted by the conifers that are coming in. And the lichen lungwort then is what establishes, and for centuries after that, it produces all the nitrogen needed by the forest. I have an interesting quote here. It's from Trig Steen. He's an environmental science professor at Portland State University. I took a course in forest ecology from him many years ago and thought he did a great job. He's an evolutionist. He's also a good observer of the forest. And what he says is this. Let me just read it to you. So this three-way team, that is the fungus, the algae, and the bacteria in lobaria, this collaboration is really fundamental to maintaining the flow of nitrogen through our forest ecosystems. And this collaboration raises to me a really, really fundamental point that people miss. And we will run into it again and again, and that is that people often think about Darwinian evolution as being survival of the fittest, tooth and claw, wipe out the other guy, win at all costs, but mainly get rid of everything else. In reality, survival of the fittest in a forest ecosystem very often means not killing off, but collaborating. Collaboration and teamwork end up trumping in a huge array of cases, and in fact, the whole forest is ultimately dependent on collaboration, not fundamentally competition. And this lichen, lungwort, is certainly a beautiful example of that. So remember that word collaboration. I believe it does accurately describe much of what happens in a forest ecosystem, and you can think about some implications of that. Listed here are the major processes that occur in a west side forest canopy. I'll go through them fairly quickly, but a lot of things happen up in the canopy. We said it's important, it's a very active area. So there's photosynthesis. In other words, the sun's energy is captured and is stored as sugar. Also, carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere and stored as sugar. And oxygen is released, and it replaces that which has been used by animals. We also have transpiration. Transpiration is the loss of water from plant leaves, and that's through little pores called stomata. So soil, the rain comes down on the forest floor, there's soil water, and then the trees, roots will absorb that or take that in, and then the vascular system of trees will transport that water up to the canopy. And at that point, it escapes into the air through those little pores, and this whole cycle keeps going on. It's part of the water cycle, the hydrologic cycle. I found one interesting statement here. A giant sequoia tree has been described as a huge silent pump that each day lifts 500 gallons of water over 250 feet into the sky and continues doing so for thousands of years. That's quite an engineering feat. Reproduction of trees occurs in the canopy. The formation of cones and seeds and pollination and seed dispersal and all those things are maximal up there. The canopy intercepts sunlight. Where there is gaps in the canopy, the sun comes right on through to the forest floor. Where the canopy is dense, there's no light to speak of coming through. There is shade. Atmospheric interactions, number 5. The canopy captures fog and rain and snow and ice. For example, fog condenses as little droplets on the needles of Douglas fir and other conifers, and then it drips to the forest floor. And that needle drip from the conifer needles accounts for up to 50% of the precipitation in some forests. It's hugely important. In winter, snow and ice add weight to the trees, so twigs and branches and entire tree trunks crash to the forest floor, and they get entered into the decomposition process that we'll talk about in just a minute. Canopy plants intercept airborne nutrients. A good example is you get in the Sahara Desert, you get a sandstorm, and dust particles get up in the atmosphere and travel over to, say, Brazil, and the air plants there, the orchids and so forth, use those nutrients that are sailing that great distance through the atmosphere. Lightning strikes canopy trees, producing snags, which is good wildlife habitat, and incidentally, lightning also fixes nitrogen. We keep coming back to that. Number 6 is nutrient cycling, and we just talked a little bit about that with nitrogen. 7, the canopy is the home of epiphytes, and we've talked about that, but let me say one more thing. The epiphytes, all those mosses and ferns and so forth, actually produce soil in the canopy that is underneath the epiphytes along the branches of trees. So there is canopy soil, which is important for number 8, because number 8 says canopy roots. A number of years ago, a young lady named Nalini Nadkarni at the University of Washington here in Seattle, was studying forestry and started doing research on the Olympic Peninsula on the epiphytes in the maple trees. And she would peel back the mosses and so forth, and she looked, and the branches of the maple tree had what looked for the world like roots coming out of them. And she took samples home and photographs to her professors, and they'd never seen anything like that. But what she had done is discovered what we now call canopy roots. That the trees put roots into the soil to get nutrients, but they also put roots into the soil that's up along their branches, and they extract nitrogen and water and other things. So canopy roots was a topic that has been found throughout the world in many different trees now. The canopy is a source of forest floor litter, and a great deal of it. We'll come to that also. The canopy produces structural complexity. Think about this. A plantation forest is planted with one species of tree at the same time, and so they are the same size trees, and evenly spaced field of small trees. But in contrast to that, so that's a sort of a simple structure. In contrast, the old forests, after a lot of time, are very complex in that they have different sized trees, they have dead trees, live trees, different species, and so forth. So there's more complexity, meaning there's more habitat, there's more rooms, there's more niches for all kinds of creatures, plants and animals to live there that would not be found in the plantation forests. And those can include invertebrates, number 11, which would be largely bugs. There's thousands of bug species up in the canopy. Many have no names, many don't know what they do, but when they find out on many of them, they are doing useful things. So it's a kind of a unknown up there. There's also vertebrate animals that when you hike through the forest, you don't see, or rarely see them, but they live in the canopy. And I'll give you an example here. I was hiking on the Salmon River Trail and found this unfortunate bird. It's a hermit warbler, and it winters in the tropics. It migrates to the northwest to reproduce high in our forest canopies, and I've never seen one live seen one near ground level at all, except this one. Brings to mind a couple of scriptures. It says, "For every beast of the forest is mine," God speaking. "I know all the birds of the hills," from Psalm 50. And then from Matthew 10, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground, apart from the will of your Father." So it looks like the Creator knew this little warbler and was aware of its fall from the forest canopy. Also found this along the Clackamas River. And you say, what is that? Well, it's not feathers, it's hair. It took me a little while to put it together, but that hair, and it's really flat. So what that is the tip of a northern flying squirrel's tail. And so they use their tails, they go from tree to tree gliding, but they use their tail as a rudder. And that's the tip of one. Another canopy animal that you seldom encounter. Well, let's go then from the canopy to the other area that's not well understood, which is hard to study also, and that would be the soil and decomposition. No waste management company did not invent recycling. God did, and we'll show that. So consider this. Continuously, day and night, organic debris falls from the canopy to the forest floor. It includes needles, broadleaves, cones, seeds, pieces of moss and lichen, dead bugs, feathers, droppings from birds and arboreal mammals, twigs, pieces of bark and wood, and on occasion, centuries-old mammoth trees, both the living ones and the dead ones. And then all of this stuff accumulates and forms a litter layer on the forest floor. And then something remarkable happens. Over the days and months and years and even centuries, that material gets broken down into its basic elements, incorporated into the soil, and again becomes available for growing plants to use. How does all this happen? And here we see an important organism in the decomposition process, a yellow-spotted millipede. Anybody seen these in the forest? Oh, quite a few, yeah. You hike along, you see these little ones multi-leggedly walking along across the trail, for example. And, of course, you might pick it up. I'm sure you'd be inclined to do that, and sniff of it, and it smells like almonds. The reason it smells like almonds is that it emits cyanide gas, which smells like almonds. Not enough to hurt you, but it's enough to maybe deter a small predator. The spots, actually, when they're yellow, that are in the animal kingdom, that's sort of a warning to other creatures that, I'm poisonous, leave me alone. So it has these spots. Well, why is this millipede important? First of all, it has been found that it provides entry into the decomposition process for at least half, of all the needles and all the broadleaves that fall to the forest floor. In other words, these millipedes eat them, grind them up, extract nutrients from them for their own use, but then they excrete fecal pellets made of these materials, and bacteria and fungi and so forth can complete the process of breaking them down, and so they can be used again by plants. So this is one of the most important creatures in the decomposition of needles and leaves. And here's a quote from Andrew Muldanky at Oregon State University, who studied this in great depth. He says, throughout northwest forests, the principal shredder is the cyanide-producing millipede, Harpaphe haydeniana. It is a shredder that is key. It is the shredder that is key to the process, decomposition, that is. The cyanide-producing millipede alone eats 33 to 50% of all dead coniferous and deciduous leaves that come to rest on the forest floor. It is one of the most critical links in the entire food web. And he concludes with being tiny is not the same as being unimportant. Here's another creature. You've all seen those. A banana slug. Well, this is another member of the forest cleanup crew. And this is a different species of banana slug than the bright yellow one I showed you from the redwoods. You might call this dark olive-colored banana slug, an overripe banana slug. Anyways, let's look at some features of this critter. It has 4 retractable tentacles. The top 2 detect light, and the bottom ones are for smell and touch. The head is covered with a mantle, and there's a breathing pore you can see, and it's only on the right side, never on the left. The underside is called the foot, on which the animal glides. And notice now it has some needles stuck to its back. It's kind of sticky, so needles that land on it stick there and stay there. And so why is not this creature just covered with needles and other forest debris? Well, it has a self-cleaning system. It has skin glands that secrete slime. If you've ever picked one of these up, you realize that. And that slime is like a conveyor belt that moves backwards over the animal, carrying with it any debris to the tail end. And you can see there's a mucus plug, and there's some needles there and slime. And then the animal periodically reaches back and eats the mucus plug. So he recycles slime and the needles as well. That's pretty cool, I think. You agree? Yeah, okay. Slugs eat all kinds of things, vegetation, live, they like poison oak. And I don't think they're allergic. I've never seen one scratch. Bulbs, roots, fruits, seeds, mushrooms, lichens, animal droppings, animal carcasses, all kinds of things they eat, which means these things are entering into decomposition. So you can see that the banana slug is a beautiful, useful, and interesting animal, and that's why it was chosen by students as the official mascot for the University of California in Santa Cruz. They are the banana slugs. And this banana slug is reading a book, and if you read the fine print, it says Plato. So he was a smart banana slug. Well, we've just seen that small forest debris can enter decomposition through millipedes and slugs and other organisms. What about a big standing tree trunk or bole like this? How is it decomposed? And what about large logs on the forest floor? Such material as this is called, in ecological jargon, coarse woody debris. And it's abundant in old forests. Such debris can be quite large, like this log in the Olympic National Forest. And here's a cross-section of a huge log, maybe some of you have seen. It's in the National Park Visitor Center near Port Angeles, and it's 650 years old. And you can see it's been labeled to show that in 1349, when the tree started growing, that's in the center there, but then 1492, when Columbus came, as a second marker, and then 1620, when the Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock. So the question comes to mind then is just how does a huge log like this and the other stuff I showed you, how do they decompose, and what processes are involved, and how long would it take? And to find answers, you can go to this, a log decomposition study currently underway in the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest near Eugene in the Willamette National Forest. Dr. Mark Harmon is the investigator. His goal is to learn how logs decay. And the study consists of about 500 log sections laid out in certain patterns on the forest floor, which are being studied and monitored over the years. He began in 1985, and he plans the study to go for 200 years. Mark's not going to do the whole thing himself, though. But that's an example of what's called a long-term ecological study. Most studies are short-term, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Why? Because graduate students got to get done with it and get their degree. But many ecological processes, like log decomposition, takes a long, long time. And so long-term studies are important. Here's some people working on the study, and they're cutting some sections of the logs, and they'll transport them to the study site. At various times then, over the years, sections are taken for study, and each section is called a cookie. So you could call this chainsaw the man is using there a cookie cutter, I guess. Here's a cookie displayed, and the TSHE at the bottom means it's a hemlock. It was cut in 1992, 7 years after being placed at the study site. It's 24 inches in diameter. The undecayed wood has been outlined, and the rotting areas are labeled, and you can see excavations from various burrowing insects and discolorations from various types of fungi and so forth. So these and many other observations are being done, and a lot is being learned. Just on terminology, and I want to tell you a little story about decomposition, but here we see a log, a fresh log, cut, and you can see there's the outer bark, and then there's an inner bark inside of that, and then a growth layer, which is one of the living parts of the tree, the cambium, and then the outer sapwood is where it's a lighter colored, and it's where the water is transported in the tree, and nutrients as well. And the heartwood, which is a darker color, and that's a strong central core that supports the tree trunk, and of course the annual growth rings are apparent. But here is a greatly simplified, abbreviated outline of what has been learned about log decomposition. I'm just going to go through it real quickly. Don't try to remember it, but get the idea. So a conifer tree falls on the forest floor in a winter storm. In spring, the inner bark ferments, producing an alcohol odor which attracts large numbers of ambrosia beetles. The ambrosia beetles bore through the bark, forming a network of tunnels. Ambrosia beetles carry with them a special fungus which decomposes wood and thrives in the wood tunnels. Ambrosia beetles use the fungus as their own food, and they produce more larvae and more beetles. Soon bark beetles, different species, also arrive, and they release a pheromone into the air that attracts more bark beetles. The bark beetles dig tunnels and galleries into the surface wood and reproduce. Their offspring dig in deeper. Water, fungi, and bacteria and other insects enter the bark beetle tunnel networks. After months, the ponderous borer beetles, big beetles, arrive, and they lay eggs in the bark, and their larvae bore deeply into the decay-resistant heartwood, the center of the logs. Carpenter ants also invade the log. They build galleries and reproduce. Other organisms, including numerous mites, nematodes, roundworms, and so forth, they enter the tunnel system. And then predators also come in. They're attracted to feed on all these inhabitants. They include wasps and centipedes and salamanders and pileated woodpeckers and black bears. And the latter two, the woodpeckers and bears, actually mechanically break apart some of these decomposing logs. By 3 years after the tree fell down, wind-borne fungal spores have entered the tunnels, producing special fungi that break down the very hard heartwood, which contains a substance called lignin that's hard to digest. In about 10 years, the wood has become soft, and now damp wood termites invade. And their guts have anaerobic, non-oxygen requiring protozoans, little microscopic organisms that break down the cellulose in wood. Termite guts also produce nitrogen-fixing, or have nitrogen-fixing bacteria. In other words, there's this whole complex relay of species after species after species that over a great period of time takes a log, even a big one, and breaks it down into its basic elements, and it's recycled, it's reused again by the forest. Dr. Harmon, who's directing the study, he made this interesting observation. A dead tree, actually, if you tally up the number of living cells and the number of living organisms, is far more alive than a living tree. And that's a true statement. Just to show you something probably you've seen in our forest, here's a decaying log, and it has young hemlocks growing on it, and so this would be called a nurse log, and that's a very common thing. The log probably provides water and nutrients for the hemlocks. That's why the pioneers came here, and they saw hemlocks in the forest growing in straight lines. They wondered, did the native peoples plant them that way, or what? No, they grew on logs, and the logs simply have decomposed and have completely disappeared into the soil, but the hemlocks are growing in a line. Logs fall into streams. Prior to about 1980, it was a common practice to remove them so they would not impede fish movement, especially salmon. But more recently, studies of logs in streams have shown that the fish do better with logs in the streams. The logs form calm pools, they slow currents, they reduce the bank erosion, they release nutrients into the water, and so forth. And so now it's more of a practice to put logs back in streams to try to restore salmon habitat. Not only do logs benefit salmon, but salmon benefit the forest. After spawning, our salmon, of course, die, and they release their nutrients into the water. But also there's scavengers like ravens and turkey vultures and gulls and eagles and bears and weasels and on we go that eat the dead and dying salmon, and then they carry the nutrients from the salmon way up into the mountains and into the forest. And so in the 1800s, some of the pioneers would say you could walk across the streams on the backs of salmon. They were that dense. And of course now there's fewer salmon, and the question is, will the loss of all these salmon nutrients or the reduction have an impact on the forests? And that's being studied, and I don't know much more about it than that. We're not going to take a break yet. I'm going to wind it up here, but that tree really got broken. Let's look at a couple of other forest floor and soil processes. This is a beautiful plant, Pacific bleeding heart, blooms in the west side forest in spring. Flowers are heart-shaped, hence the name. Here's a long seed pod forming by the plant. And when ripe, the pods are filled with these strange-looking seeds. And here I photographed one using a dissecting microscope. And you can see the brown thing that looks sort of like a seed, but there's this glob of material that's attached to it that's called an elaeosome. You might say, what is that? Well, an elaeosome is a tasty, nutrient-rich appendage attached to seeds of certain species of plants. In other words, it's ant food. So remember we said that in the canopy, seeds get dispersed easily by the wind, and they go distances because they're so high up. But think about the forest floor plants, that's not going to work for them. So they need something to spread out the seeds, and oftentimes that is ants. There's even a name for seed dispersal by ants. If you want to sound educated, you say myrmecochory, and nobody will understand you, but that's the term for it. Just showing you a thatch ant nest that we found on one of our field trips, and the thatch ants are just numerous as can be, and they're busily remodeling all the time their stick and needle home. And they are a good citizen of the forest. They do valuable things. They're not pests or that. These are native species. And they control some of the defoliating insects, keep them in check, like the spruce budworm and so forth. You can think about the scripture here that says, "Go to the ant, you sluggard, consider its ways and be wise. It has no commander, no overseer or ruler, yet it stores its provisions in summer and gathers its food at harvest." Another subject, I'll do this kind of quickly. How many have heard of mycorrhizal fungi? Did I see one? Two. Okay. Mycorrhizal fungi, the term means fungus root. Myco is fungus, rhizo is root. And what it refers to is this: the roots of our trees and most other plants go out so far, and they're bringing in water and nutrients to the plant. But almost all of these plants have extenders, that is fungal filaments that attach to the roots, and they go out meters, many tens of meters, great distance throughout the forest soil. And these mycorrhizal fungi act as extenders for the tree, and so the tree is actually taking the nutrients from a great distance away. Here's an electron micrograph showing the two bigger structures are root tips, and then all the fungal filaments are attached and then extending here tens of meters in distance. Some of the mushrooms that you see in the forest are the fruiting bodies or the spore-producing bodies of these mycorrhizal fungi. Again, the fungus then transports water and nutrients to the host plant, and the plant itself provides sugars as food for the fungus. That's a symbiosis, a close living association. It's a mutualism because both the fungus and the plant benefit. This is extremely important. It just basically says if we didn't have these fungi, we wouldn't have forests as we know them, at least. The trees would be stunted, and they've done experiments with that. The last thing I'll mention is this, and just fire. Fires are destructive, of course, but we also hear a lot of talk about they have benefits as well, and I think that's true. For example, an old forest dominated by large Douglas firs, as here. If you go and look on the forest floor, you'll find lots of cones with these mice tails and so forth. And you don't find any young Douglas firs growing there. The Douglas fir is not reproducing. When a big Douglas fir comes crashing down in a forest like that, what replaces it? Well, it's not Douglas fir because it's not growing there. It's the hemlock growing on these nurse logs that replaces the Douglas fir. So over time, a Douglas fir forest transitions into a hemlock forest as time goes on. Why is that? Well, in order to germinate, in order to start growing and produce seedlings, Douglas fir requires mineral soil, not mosses and organic matter, but mineral soil, and it requires not shade of a forest, but a lot of sunlight. And so how does Douglas fir ever regenerate? Well, large Douglas firs, as the mice knew, survive forest fires oftentimes because of their thick bark and various other reasons. And so after the forest fire goes through, they shower the area with seeds. And now, after the fire has burned away the mosses and the litter down to the mineral soil. Also, the hemlocks and cedars with thin bark have died, and so there's big gaps where the sunlight comes in. So fire regenerates Douglas fir, and otherwise it would continue to become more and more of a hemlock forest. So that's an interesting sequence, I think. I'm going to skip a little bit here for the sake of time. Lodgepole pines have some interesting adaptations, but this is Yellowstone National Park after a fire went through there. Let me kind of wind things up here with this idea. As you drive past plantation forests, you sometimes see signs that say working forest, indicating a forest at work producing wood products. But I would suggest, however, that all forests, including the unmanaged ones, are working, because they are all producing what are called ecosystem services. What are they? Well, here are the services that are provided by healthy forests. And I'm just going to read through this quickly, comment minimally. But they conduct photosynthesis. The forests help control the heat balance of the earth. They play an important role in the water cycle. They reduce erosion, floods, and debris flows. They maintain healthy streams. They provide good salmon and trout habitat. They moderate weather and climate. They create and preserve soils. They store carbon biomass. They conserve and cycle nutrients. They maintain biodiversity of plants and animals. They help control forest disease outbreaks, like with those ants I showed you. There are aesthetic values, but that means beauty and scenery. There are spiritual values. Now, I'm not saying you go out and worship trees, but we must realize that the trees do reflect the glory of the Creator, who made them. It supports scientific and educational activities, recreational activities of all sorts, and of course, wood products of all sorts as well. Wood, paper, mushrooms, medicines, decorative plants, all kinds of things. So let me conclude with 5 statements. Just some things that I tried to glean out of this sort of information. And the first is this. Forest ecosystems consist of thousands of biotic and abiotic components, living and non-living components, which interact in complex and collaborative, again, benefiting each other, ways to produce an entity we call a forest, which only works well if all its major parts are present and functioning. Just like we say cells and organisms and that are irreducibly complex, they only function when all the parts and processes are there. Well, forests are the same thing. Ecosystems are the same thing. It suggests that, just like cells and humans and so forth that must have been created whole, as they are, so would ecosystems, like a forest ecosystem, have been created whole, not cobbled together piece by piece over millions of years. That doesn't seem to make much sense. Nothing works until everything works. You might remember Michael Behe wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box, in which he talked about irreducible complexity of a mousetrap. I'm not going to elaborate more, but some of you may have read that book. A quote, Jack Ward Thomas, former chief of the Forest Service, said, "Ecosystems are not only more complex than we think, they are more complex than we can think." Secondly, implicit in the Dominion Mandate is a requirement for knowledge about forest ecosystems, which we must acquire through careful scientific study. We need knowledge to do things right in caring for forests and everything else. So we need good scientific study. Jerry Franklin, a forest ecologist, says, "Stewardship of our forest resources is one of the great challenges of the 21st century, and a first principle in responsible management is knowledge." Thirdly, good biblical stewardship should take into consideration the full array of ecosystem services provided by the Creator. In addition to timber harvest, attention should be given to fish and wildlife management and recreation and scientific and educational pursuits, as well as simply the preservation of the beauty and majesty of our great forests. And I like a quote from Theodore Roosevelt along those lines. He said this, "There is nothing more practical in the end than the preservation of beauty. I feel most emphatically that we should not turn into shingles a tree which was old when the first Egyptian conquerors penetrated to the valley of the Euphrates. He had a way of saying things. And then, fourthly, to learn how to manage for multiple ecosystem services, as we're talking about, you should study the natural or unmanaged forests, as I showed in my diagram previously, and one should mimic them. Why? Simply because those unmanaged forests are successfully providing those services all simultaneously. And also, I would say that the forests that we call unmanaged forests are not unmanaged. I would suggest that they're controlled and superintended by their creator, who is God. I think God is involved in all these processes, and it's really his hand at work that we're seeing. And so I know at Design Science Association we've had programs about mimicking nature, mimicking the natural world, the created world, and we can come up with some good things, inventions and so forth, like the Velcro that we use all the time. Well, that was figured out by looking at plants that that stick to your clothing and so forth. So mimicking the unmanaged forests is probably a good thing. There's a book on it, on ecological forest management. I'm not going to go into that. And lastly, Christians should provide quality outdoor education based on a biblical worldview for children and for adults in order to foster an appreciation for and understanding of ecosystems, forests and others, and their stewarding. Perhaps Christians should even become leaders promoting sound and balanced forest management practices. After all, we worship the God who created and sustained forests. And with this view of vine maple in autumn, I will conclude. The end. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. We do have some time to take a few questions, so think of a question you want to ask, raise your hand, and I'll bring the mic around. And, yeah.
Very interesting. Among the other benefits of, I think, both managed forests and unmanaged forests is the trees clean the air.
Yes.
In a number of ways. They trap smoke particles and dust particles and things like that. I don't recall that I saw that there, but
I don't think I had that on. The closest I come, it said that nutrients can sail through the air and be used by the plants, and that, which would be somewhat similar.
Sure.
Yes.
And it occurred to me that I have seen many times places where fire has partially burned a tree, and it has changed. Those burned areas don't seem to nearly decompose nearly as fast as an unburned area. So I was wondering if you have any comment about how burned wood might decompose, because it seems to take much longer.
That's interesting. Well, first of all, burning is decomposition, so in that sense, if it burns up totally, it decomposes very quickly. But you're saying that the burning sort of protects it from the insects and so forth. I don't know. I hadn't thought about that. I haven't read anything about that. It's an interesting observation. So if you document that and look for answers, I don't know.
Okay, other questions out there? One thing that struck me, you're showing all those tree rings.
Yeah.
How accurate can we assume that they are in getting the age of the trees? And
well, typically you will cut a tree down and count the rings, or take a core and count the rings. And a ring is a light area and a dark area. So that's one ring. And often, and generally speaking, that indicates 1 year. In the spring of the year, When there's a lot of water, the tree grows faster and produces a light-colored ring. Later, when it gets hot and then drier and so forth, it produces a darker aspect to the ring. I think there's a lot that can be learned from that. That's called dendrochronology, the study of those rings. But it's complex, and there are instances where each ring represents a year, but that's not always the case. In certain places, at certain times, there can be different seasons during the year, wet and dry, wet and dry, and wet and dry, that produce more rings, several rings in one year. So again, you have to consider that as a possibility that the ring counts are not totally accurate as to one ring equals 1 year.
So what do we think the oldest tree is along the west coast?
Well, the oldest trees, the bristlecone would be down in California and Nevada, bristlecone pine. And the oldest tree here, I suppose the redwoods, they're over 2,000 years old. And there's Douglas firs are quite old. I don't have an exact figure. I think in the Northwest, if you count California, the redwoods would be the top.
Okay, other questions out there? So it looks like the forest system was designed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think years ago, I started out as a forestry major at the University of Idaho. I didn't go very far. I switched to zoology and then to medicine. But at that time, I think the belief was that the forest system was much simpler. And, dirt was dirt. That was simple. But what we're learning now, as they look into it more and more, dirt is the most complex thing you can think about. There's literally thousands of different organisms, many of them microscopic, that are doing things, and we don't know what they're doing. We know some of them are doing, but a lot of it, they have never been named, or they have no idea what they're doing. It's a complex system that functions well, and I think I would feel that this was made whole. It was a created system, and so each part is playing its role, and it's a good evidence of complexity, and complexity indicates design. It's very hard to think how this whole forest thing has gotten, as I said, cobbled together piece by piece over millions and millions of years. That's difficult to imagine. It's much better to think that it was made whole, just like we were made whole, and we're complex too, of course.
Well, okay, we're going to wrap up the Q&A here, but Keith will be available for a while yet too, if you have some more questions you want to ask of him. So let's thank him for that. Okay, just a few wrap-up things. Our speaker next month is no stranger to us. He's been here a number of times, and that is Chris Ashcraft. And Chris is a teacher at the Christian school at the Cedar Park school system. He's been teaching there for a long time, and he's got quite a ministry. He's got a lot of good talks that he gives. Last year, he gave part one of this talk of Old Testament archaeology. So next month, he's going to give the part two. And you'll be interested. People have questions about what about the chronology of the pharaohs in Egypt? Do they agree with the theology or the chronology in the Bible? And can we identify the pharaohs at the time of Moses and other core places in the Bible? So I think you're going to find that interesting, because sometimes people say, well, the time frame in the Egyptian chronology was way much longer than the Bible. Well, it turns out it's not, and Chris will explain why. Okay, so he's coming on August the 22nd. Remember, talk to Ron if you have an interest in the tour, Christian tour of the Dry Falls or Mount St. Helens. And other flyers are on the back table there as well for upcoming meetings and other information you might have want to know about. So anything on the back table is for free. There are books and DVDs and on the resources we have available. We have a lot of DVDs, and as I announced last time, we are reducing the prices on the DVDs because we want to start to move them. We have quite a few different ones. Take a look at some, and if you have an interest, then you can purchase them at the back. But we also have some books for you to look at. There's a sign-up sheet on the back. If you're not on our mailing list, you can add your name and email to the back table there. So again, we thank you for your support of this ministry and the way we support that. There are donation boxes in the back, and if you care to donate there, you can just either cash or check in there. But some people also like to donate online. We have a donate button on our apologeticsforum.org website. So if you care to do that, you can do it that way as well. So again, we appreciate your support of our ministry, and we'll look forward to the next talk by Chris in August. So, and there's also some refreshments in the back. There are cookies and coffee and tea and things like that. So let me just close on a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed. Father, we just thank you for this time. We thank you for Keith's message. And Lord, you are the designer of everything we see on this earth, and we thank you that you have given us the ability to study your work, your creation. And we thank you that for Keith, who has taken that to a deeper level than most of us have. And we just thank you for allowing him to expound that to us. We pray for Chris as he comes next month as well, Lord, and we look forward to that. And we just look for your blessings on the results of this ministry. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.